In this second video in the series of how to integrate FlutterFlow with OpenAI's newest model, GPT-4o, we're going to structure the backend for storing the chat conversations, design the page, and then implement the logic. For this demo, we're going to use Firebase, and I've already set that up. I've left a link in the description if you need help setting that up. All right, the first step in building any backend schema, that is what collections of data you need and what fields you need in those collections, is to list what entities, what buckets of data you're going to need. Well, we're building a chat app, so we're going to need to store our chats, that is each conversation. So we'll need a collection of chats. Second, we need to store the messages in those chats. So we'll have a collection of messages. Now, because these two collections are related to each other, that is, chats have messages, we need to determine how to relate these two collections. And there are two options: top-level collections that you relate by a shared ID or reference, or a top-level collection and a sub-collection. Either one would work fine, so we're going to go with a sub-collection. Next, let's figure out what fields we need for each collection. So we're going to need to know whose chat this is, like which user. So let's add a unique ID that references the user. We're also going to need to order these chats when we display them, so we can see the most recent chat first. So let's add a timestamp. Finally, we'll need a title for each chat, and that's good for our chats collection. For our messages, we'll need the messages themselves. We also need to know whose message it is, like is it the user or ChatGPT? And for that, we'll use an enum. Enums are great when you have only a few values that you want available. So for us, it'll either be the user or ChatGPT, which we'll call assistant. And then finally, we'll need a timestamp. And that's because when we display these messages, we'll need to order them like a normal conversation. Okay, great. One quick tip on designing backend schema: if you're struggling, just go to ChatGPT or Gemini, tell it what you're building and what backend you're using, and it'll give you a great model. And if you're confused about something, you can just ask a follow-up question. Beautiful. Our backend schema is ready to go. Let's go design the UI. All right, so we've got a blank page here, and we want to build a simple chat UI with a text input on the bottom and the chats coming in on the top. Okay, so because these things are stacked on top of one another, we can just throw in a column as our main architectural widget. Then we need one widget that will hold our messages and one widget for our text input. So for the top one, let's use a list view because that's good for performance when displaying a lot of data. And we can put a text field in down here. Beautiful. Let's come up to our column right here and give it a little padding to push it off edges. Then we're going to come to our list view right here and make it expanded so it fills the entire space. And I've already got a style set up for our text field here in our widget style. So I'm just going to apply that now. Now, just so we can see what's going on inside this list view, I've already built a component that we can use here. So let's come over here to our components and grab in our chat. Now let's come back to our list view, and you can see that we want to change this because we don't want the messages up here, because typical in chat LLMs, they come in from the bottom here. So we can just click reverse. We don't want it shrink wrap. That can just affect performance. Next, let's jump into this chat bubbles component to see how we built it. Now it's hard to see our text right here, so you can just come up here and change the canvas color so you can see it better. And that looks good. Now, just note that this is not editing anything in this component and won't be shipped with your app. This is simply the canvas for when you're working with it. Okay, so how have we built this component? Well, you can see up here that we've simply got one row right here that has two children. The one on the left is a stack of two different icons. And here we've just got some text that will be our message. Now, we've set up one parameter for this component, that is what data is coming into this component, and that is a messages document. That is the documents coming in from the messages collection that we set up. And this text right here is bound to the content property of that messages document. And then over here, we're conditionally showing and hiding one of these two icons depending on whose message it is. Because remember, we've got messages coming from ChatGPT called an assistant and messages coming from the user. That's what you type in. And And when it's the user right here, we want to show it. So we're looking at the role property and we're seeing if it equals the role user here. And if it does, it'll show the user icon. That is that image of that gentleman, right? If not, it'll show this star icon, which is the icon for the GPT assistant. We don't need to do that for our message right here because it'll always show whatever's in that content field. Okay, that's all set up. Let's go back to the page. Let's just do some housekeeping here. So in our text field down here, we don't want it to say label here, and we actually don't want a label just because of our style we've set up. We want it as a hint. That is, you'll see it here and then it'll disappear when the user starts typing. The label will move up to the top here. So we don't want that. And in our hint text, we'll just say, ask me anything. All right, great. This is done. We're ready to implement the logic. So let's get an overall picture of how this logic is going to work. And there's a great question to ask when you're trying to figure out complex logic. What data needs to be maintained for each session? That is, when the user is using this page, doing whatever they do on this page, and for us it's chatting, what data do we need to make that happen? Well, we're going to need some messages to display. So that means we're going to need a variable to store those messages. Now, the normal pattern in FlutterFlow is to store those messages in a variable and then update just that variable. That's instead of directly updating the widgets from the response from an API call. This gives us much more control and avoids a handful of potential problems. Now, when you need to store this data in a variable, you have two main options, a page state variable or an app state variable. And which you will use will depend on the design of your app. We just need the data here, so we're going to use a page state variable. Okay, what other data needs to be maintained? Well, we also need to keep track of which conversation it is that we're in. So let's make a variable called chatRef, which will store a reference to the chat we're in. All right, so let's set up this logic. First, let's bind those state variables on this page. So we've got our messages variable, which will be used to populate our messages here. So let's come into our list view here and come over here to dynamically generating children and set that equal to our page state variable called messages. Beautiful. We'll come in here and call this message item and save. And then we want to pass each of those items into our chat bubbles here. So let's come down and in here, we want to pass this message item and confirm. Beautiful. All right, we're now ready to set up all that logic. So how do we want this logic to start execution? Well, the user is going to type something into this field right here, and when they submit that, that's when we want the logic to kick off. So we can come here and let's give us some more space here in our action flow editor. We're on the on submit trigger and let's add an action. All right, so what do we want to happen? Well, we're starting a new conversation. So we probably want to create a new chat document in our chats collection. But there's one other condition we have to consider, and that is when the user is using this text field right here, sometimes it'll be a new chat, but sometimes it'll be continuing another chat, like their second message or their 10th message. So before we create a new chat conversation, we have to check for a condition. We have to check whether this is a new chat or an ongoing chat. So we want to add a conditional action. And what are we going to do here? Well, remember we already set up a page state variable to track our chat data. So we can add a condition here, and the first condition will be that chat reference right here. And we want to see if it is set. And so if it is set, then this would be true, which means this would be an ongoing conversation. If it's false over here, this will be a new conversation. So let's deal with the logic in our new conversation first. So we come in here and we want to add another action. And if it's a new chat, then we don't have any chat document yet. So let's create one. So we're going to come into Firestore here and create a new document. The new document will be chats, and we want to set the fields of the unique ID and not the title. We can handle that in another video. So instead, we're just going to set the timestamp. So let's set that first, and we just want to set that to the current time. And the unique ID, which is a document reference to our user. So we just want the authenticated user's user reference. Beautiful. Now, I know that this logic is going to get quite complex and long, so it's a good habit to get into naming your actions here. So the naming convention that I like to do is to first set set the type of action. So here would be a database action, and then what it's doing. So here we're just creating a chat doc. This is going to make it easier later when we see all of our actions to quickly understand what each node does. Finally, let's name our output variable name. And we need to do this because we're going to use this document in the next step, because we're keeping track of which chat it is in that page state variable. So if you know you're going to need the value coming out of this action, then make sure you give it a name, because that's how you'll make it available. Now, you might think that we just want to call this chat doc or something like that. But because we have this conditional action set up, and each of these sides are going to have similar sets of logic, a good pattern to use is to append something in front here so you know what branch of logic you're in. So I'm just going to call this new for a new chat, and I'll append that to all of my action output variables. So when I'm looking into those, it's easy to quickly identify what it is. Okay, so I've created this new chat document. That chat document will be returned to me and will be placed into this variable right here. So now we need to update that page state variable so we know what chat we're in. Remember, that's this variable that we're checking right here. So let's come in here, let's add an action. We can search for page, and right there we've got update page state. Which one do we want? We want our chat reference. We want to set the value right here, and the value we want is coming from an output down here. So let's open that up, and there it is, new chat doc. And what do we want in here? Well, we are looking for a document reference, and so we want reference right there. Beautiful. Let's give this action a good name right here. So what kind of thing it is? It's state, because we're updating a page state variable, and it is our chat doc. Finally, down to this update type rate. Now, this is not a necessary step, but it is good for optimization. And by default, whenever you change a state variable in FlutterFlow, it will rebuild the current page. That is, the UI will be update, but you only want to update your UI when you need to update the UI. That is, when there's a change that you want the user to see. But here, this would be unnecessary. And that's because there's nothing in the UI that is dependent upon this variable. So the shorthand rule to memorize is, if you need to see something, rebuild. If not, don't. All right, what do we want to do next? Well, the users submitted a message. So let's write that message to Firestore. So let's come in here and add an action. We want it to be Firestore create document. It's going to be our messages collection. And because we have our messages set up as a sub collection, we need to give a reference as to which chat this message is a child. Well, we've just managed that over here, so we can reference that. So here's our page state, and here's our chat reference. Beautiful. So now it knows which chat, which conversation it is that we want to relate these messages to. And now we just need to set fields. So we have our timestamp here, which we can just set to our global property of current time. Let's close that up. And our next field is role. That is this the user or ChatGPT? And we've got two options here, and it's our user. And it looks like this because we've defined this as enum. And finally, we have our content. That is the message itself. Well, we don't want to hard code a value. We want it from a variable, and the variable is going to be from the widget itself, this text field right here. Okay, great. Now we will be using this later. So let's give it a name. We'll call it new chat because we're in this new chat branch, new message. Finally, let's name this right here. And what kind of thing? This is a database action, and it is a message, and specifically it's our user. Beautiful. Now you may think that our next step is to send this off to OpenAI, but actually there's a step that we want to do before that. Can you figure out what it is? We want to update our UI with this message. This will create a snappier app experience because that user's message will immediately show up in our messages list view. We don't want to wait to show it until after ChatGPT responds. Well, how do we get it to show up? Well, remember, we're handling all of our messages UI through that messages state variable. That's the only thing we're ever touching. So we just need to update that. So let's come into here and add another action. It's another page state variable right there. And we want to set our fields for this messages variable. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to add it to the list. What value is it? Well, this is is a messages document. So we've already got that document here, which is coming from creating it in this step right here. So we can just add that there. Let's give it a good name. And here, I'm not going to start this with state because the main thing that this is accomplishing is a UI update. So I like to start UI updates with UI. We can already see down here with the name of the action that it has to do with state. So this provides a little bit more meaning to myself in the future when I'm trying to understand this logic. And what am I updating in the UI? Well, it's my messages. Great. And then the update type is set correctly this time because you want the page to rebuild if there's something in the UI that needs to be updated. And of course there is, because we want to see that user's message. All right, so now we're finally ready to send this off to OpenAI. So here we're going to need an API call. So search for API call, and then we can select what we want here. That's our group call, and create chat completion is the correct endpoint. Next, let's set our variables, and we only have one, which is the prompt itself. And if you remember what this prompt is it's a list of JSON, and each of those JSON objects is a different message in our chat history. Well, this is a new chat, so we only have one, the one from the user. Of course, if you want to add in a system prompt before then, you could do that as well. But we're not doing that here, so we need to just pass in our message that we receive. So we can go into our action outputs right here and come into our new chat message. And wait a second, what's going on here? Because I want to pass in this whole thing, but it only gives me like a reference and this created time thing. Well, if you ever run into this problem, scroll up to the top so you can see what type you're expecting. So here we're expecting a list of JSON objects, but here this is a document of type message. So there's a type mismatch. So let's go create a small function that will convert these documents into a list of JSON. Let's close this out. Let's come into our custom code, and we want a function, and let's give it a function name. And best way to name functions is to say exactly what it does. So this is going to be a list of messages to a list of JSON. That is, the list of messages is that page state variable, that only thing that we're ever interacting with for our messages. And we want to convert it to a list of JSON because that's what OpenAI's API is expecting. Then we can just set the return type. The return type is a list JSON right here. So it's a list. You typically don't want return type be nullable. And this is going to be JSON right there. The argument, what we're putting in here is it's going to be messages, and these will be documents. They will be a list. You typically do want your arguments to be nullable so you can handle that nullable case. And this will be document type messages. Beautiful. Now, I'm going to post some code here, but then we'll walk through it and explain each line. Of course, you can use our code Copilot, explain what it is you want in the function, and generate it that way. Just make sure you have the name that's descriptive, the return values and types, and the argument set before then, because all that gets passed into the bot. Okay, so let's come back here and let's paste in this code. And let me explain to you what this does. So first, we're doing a null check right here. That is, because this argument is nullable right here, we want to make sure we handle that case. And we're using a fallback assignment operator right here, which just basically checks if this is null, then set it equal to an empty list. Next, we're going to skip over and come back to this in a second because it'll make sense after we look at this code right here. Here, we're creating a list of JSON objects in this JSON list variable because that's what we're ultimately going to return down here. And we're mapping over this reversed messages is what we created here. And this reverse messages is simply reversing the list of messages. And that's because when we add messages into this list, it's in the opposite order that we need it to be because we need the oldest messages to be first. That's what OpenAI wants. So we're just reversing that messages list, our page state variable messages list here. Then we're mapping, we're going through each one of these, each one of our messages, and we're returning a new object with two properties, a role object and a content object. Of course, this should look familiar from OpenAI's documentation. This is what it expects. So we're going into each message, we're going into the role, and we're setting that value to this role prop. This is just how you have to access enums. And we're doing the same thing with our content. That's the message that the user types in. And then we're just calling a toList. Okay, great. So let's save this function. Let's check it for errors, and we're good. Let's jump back to our action flow editor. All right, so we're making an API API call, and we needed to convert our messages to a list JSON right here. So we wrote a custom function right down here to do that for us. So let's grab that and let's dump in our page state variable so that we can convert it into what we need. There it is. Let's confirm and confirm. Beautiful. Let's give this action a name here. We can just call it API, and we only have one API call on here, so I can leave the rest of that blank, and let's give it a good name. We're going to call this new chat response. So that is the response from this API call will be dumped into this variable right here that we'll have access to later. And what do we want to do next? Well, we'll get the response back from OpenAI, and that's just a message. So we want to write that message to our Firestore. So let's come in here. Let's add an action. We've done this before. Firestore, create document. It's going to be a messages document. Once again, we have to set chat reference, which we're storing in our page state variable right there. So that's easy. We've done it before. And we need to set our field. Again, it created at the current time. Let's confirm that. Then we want to set a role. And this time the role is going to be the assistant because it's ChatGPT's message that we're recording right here. Let's close that up. Then we have the content of the message itself. That's coming from a variable. It's coming back from our API response. And so here's our new chat response, and we can see API response. And we've already defined a data type for our response. So we want it parsed that way. We want to get a data structured field out of there. What is it? Well, it comes back in our choices, and it's just the first choice. So we want item at index, and it is the first index. I know it's getting long, and we want a data structured field out of there. And what is it? Well, it's our message, and lastly, data structured field and content. Whew. So let's confirm that, and let's give this a name. We're going to be calling it new chat assistant doc. Let's give this a name up here. This, of course, is going to be DB message and the assistant. Okay, so we've made a call. We've received back ChatGPT's response. We've recorded it in our messages collection, and now we want to show it to our users. Well, we know how to do that. We update our page state variable, but we don't exactly want to do it that way. And while we could do it that way, I want to make sure we're referencing the canonical source of truth, that is our messages database. So let's query that collection right here. So let's add an action. It's going to be a database action, and we are going to query a collection. The collection is going to be our messages. We, of course, have to reference which chat it is. So this is going to be coming from a variable, our page state variable, chat reference right here, and we want to grab all of the messages out of there. Next, we want it ordered in a certain way, and that is we want it ordered by when it's created, just like a normal conversation, and it will be decreasing. Then let's give this a name. We're going to call this new chat all messages, and let's give this action name right here, and we can call this DB collection messages. And finally, now we're ready to update our UI. So let's add an action right here, backend database. It's going to be updating page state variable. It's going to be our messages, and we want to set the value here. We want it set to an action output, and that is all those messages right there, and confirm. Yes, we want to rebuild the page because we're updating the UI. So here we can say UI messages. Beautiful. All right, so that's a lot of logic, but we're ready now to test this out. So let's do it. All right, so here's our app, and we can say, hi, can you help me with something? All right, great, this is working, but we see some problems. First, we need this text to be cleared after we send our message. And second, we need to deal with the whole other logic of continuing a conversation. Right now, this is only working for new conversations. So let's go do those two things. So first, let's clear that text field. So there's two questions we need to answer. First is how do we clear that? And we've got an action for that. So if you just search for clear, you can see we have this clear text fields or pin codes if you're using that. Now, FlutterFlow will automatically recognize your text fields and will populate them here. We only have one, and it's this poorly named text field _1 right here, and this is what we want, but let's go rename it so there's more clarity. So I've got my text field selected right here, and if you just go up here to text field, let's just call this our prompt. Okay, so now when we go back in and select this, we can see that that's updated. Great. The second question is, when do we want this logic to execute? Well, let's think about this. To answer this, we need to know, when do we no longer need the information that's in that text field? So that text field is the prompt. So once we don't need that anymore, then we can clear it. So I just dropped it in here, but that's not a good spot for it because that prompt, the message that the user sent in, is being used right here. So if we open up this content right here, we can see it's coming from that prompt. So we can move it after here. So we can just take this and do this down arrow. So we move it down to here and one more time. That's great. Now, if the way that you set it up is that you're pulling in that prompt when you make your API call, well, then you're going to have to move this down even farther. But we're not doing that because what we're doing right here is we're writing our messages to the page state variable and then passing that in. So we're not accessing it. So just make sure you don't need to access it after you clear it. All right, let's go test this out and make sure this is working. All right. Beautiful. Next, let's set up that other stream of logic so that we can have an ongoing conversation. And what I'm talking about is this line of logic here. So when the user submits from this text field, we're checking our chat reference that it's set. And remember, that's that page state variable that we assign to a chat reference when we create one in Firestore. But the second time the user submits a message, this will be already set because we already have an ongoing conversation. So what we need to do is we need to duplicate most of this logic into this conditional execution. But what we don't need is this logic, these two nodes right here, that are related to creating and storing our new chat document reference. So we can just come down here and copy this and copy the action chain, which will copy all of the logic from this onwards. And then we can just paste it in here. But what's going to happen is we're going to get tons of errors over here. And that's happening because in copying all the logic over here, we're also copying all of the references. So when we reference a different node in a subsequent node, those are copied over here. The problem is that we don't have access to those because this is executed only under a different condition. But all we need to do is walk through each node and make sure all of the references are correct. And because we've done good naming with each of our actions right here, we can quickly understand what this is doing. And so here we're writing to our database our user message. Okay, great. We are writing to our messages collection, and because that's a sub collection, we need a reference right here, and we're referencing our page state. So that's nothing localized to one conditional branch. So nothing changed there. And to fix all these, you can just come up into our debugger here, and you can see that all of these are just updating output variable names. Now, because we have this good naming convention, we can just switch these new chats to ongoing chats. So this first one is what we're on right here. So let's just come down here and change this to ongoing chat message. I'm going to copy this, and that went away. So let's just go to the next one. And so where does that bring it to? Let's go down here. This is our backend call where we're sending this stuff off to OpenAI. And so let's change this new chat response to ongoing chat response. That gets that. Let's go over here and we're moved down to this action right here. And this is new. This is ongoing. And just a few more down here. This should be ongoing. And we're getting so close. And this is actually up here. And this is updating the UI, specifically our messages. And the problem is that we're adding this new chat messages to the list, which is not what we're going for. We want ongoing chat new message. So if we come into our action outputs right here, we want ongoing chat new message right there and confirm. And next here, we're writing to our messages database and we're trying to write a new chat response here. So it's probably in this content right here. And that's the new chat response, but we haven't changed that in our backend call right here. So let's do that first. So let's come in here and we're looking for that API response, ongoing chat response. That's beautiful. And we're looking for the content. So data type, data structure field. We're looking for the choices. and the item and index, the first one, and a data structure field. We are getting close. Messages, data structure field, and finally content. And just give this a default of message. And confirm. And one last one here. Let's click down in here. And this is updating our UI messages, which is probably down here. This is our last UI update. So after we receive back the response and write it, we're going to print it here. And we want ongoing chat all messages. So we come in here and we want ongoing chat all beautiful. That's all good. So let's go test it out. All right. Let's say my dog's name is Hazel, and let's ask a follow-up question. What's my dog's name? Now, there's going to be a problem here, so I want you to watch for it and see if you can figure out what it is. Did you see that? There's actually two problems here. One is when we made our second message, it just popped it to the top of our messages right here. But then when it returned, we got back this message, but it's the same message as before. So what's going on? Well, let's go look at our logic. So the second time we send a message, we are writing that message as a document in our messages. Okay, that seems all right. Then we clear that field. That seems normal. And then we're updating our UI. And we're doing that by adding this message to the list. But there's our first problem. We're just adding this message to the end of our list as the last item in our list, but we want it to be ordered by the timestamp. And before we ordered them way down here with our Firestore query, and we ordered it there. But maybe there's a better place to order them. That's our first problem. But there's another problem because you can see that the response back from ChatGPT is the same each time, which leads me to believe that this isn't the same, that it didn't just respond the same, but it's actually just writing that first initial message twice. So why is this happening? Well, when we copied over this action chain right here, you can see that down here in this conditional action, we're checking for the new chat response, which is the same one as over here. So let's come in here and change this from new chat response to come down here, and we want our ongoing chat response. We want to check for the succeeded property and set that. Finally, let's fix our ordering problem. Now, there's multiple ways we could do this. One way is we could move all of the ordering of our list of messages up into our list view right here. And so this message always gets sorted. And this will probably be the best and easiest option to avoid duplication logic. But you would have to write a custom function to be able to sort according to those timestamps. So I'm going to show you an easier way. Let's go back into our logic right here. And what we can do is before we update this page state right here, we can add in a query. And so we are going to query a collection here, and we are going to query our messages. Let's grab it from our current chat, which is in our page state, of course. And we want to grab all of the documents, and we want to order them by our created time, and we want it to be decreasing. Let's give this a good name. So we're going to call it ongoing chat user message, and then we'll update our page state variable with that. So come here and that ongoing chat user message right there, and let's just search for it, ongoing chat user message, and confirm. And so now we can come into our update page state variable, and here we're not adding to the list, but we're just going to rewrite it. So we're going to set the value, and we are going to set it to ongoing chat user, and that's it right there. Yes, we do want to rebuild the current page, and let's go test that out. My dog's name is Hazel, and now we can say, what is my dog's name? Beautiful. Now, this is the basic setup for how to integrate with GPT-4o. Now, of course, there's a lot of other things you would want to do before you would actually launch this app. For instance, you could also add in loading animations when you're waiting for OpenAI to respond, storing chat records, storing individual chats, building out the UI so that you can access past chats, implement the streaming features so you don't have to wait for the API to completely respond and you can see it stream in word by word, creating titles for each chat. You would also want to set up all the logic for error handling for when OpenAI doesn't respond with a 200 success code. If you're interested in seeing any of these features built out, leave us a comment below and we'll see you in the next video.